one set to failure or 2 sets with multiple reps in reserve? Which of those 2 options is going to lead to more muscle growth?
You could literally, in any increment that you would want, that is going to be a pretty big contributor to the way that this question is answered.
Marcus asks a relatively simple question, but I think there's going to be a little bit more to dive in here than what meets the eye. So Marcus asks, would you rather do, or which would lead to more muscle growth? 1 set to failure or 2 sets with multiple reps in reserve? Which of those 2 options is going to lead to more muscle growth?
So I think ultimately this question is lacking some clarity in the way that it's asked, which will drastically influence the answer to it. So anytime you talk about a set or set volume, you need to clarify at what unit that is occurring at, right? So we could have 1 set per exercise and perform multiple exercises. We could have 1 set for the entire session for a given muscle group. We could have 1 set for the session in its entirety for multiple muscle groups. So we could have 1 set.
1 set per year.
Per year. You could literally, in any increment that you would want, that is going to be a pretty big contributor to the way that this question is answered. If we take this in the way that I think it's intended, I assume this is probably getting at per session volumes, if I had to guess. So 1 set to 0 RAR versus 2 sets at 3 RAR per session. And let's assume we're completing, 1 to 2 exercises per session for a given muscle group and performing 2 to 3 sessions per week for a given muscle group. So to do some quick math on kind of what we're looking at there, let's take the low end on each of those. So 1 set multiplied by 2 exercises would be 2 sets, multiplied by 2 sessions would be 4 to 6 sets per week to failure versus 4 sets versus 8 sets at failure or 0 RR. So I think if I'd answer this directly based on the research that we have, I would probably lean on the side of volume there, because the fact that this is occurring at such low volumes, going from 4 to 8 sets is going to be a pretty substantial effect. However, if this gets to substantially higher set volumes, I would probably then start to go a little bit more towards the proximity to failure side of things, partially for the diminishing returns effects of volume and the presumably semi-linear effects of proximity to failure. But also, if you factor in any sort of practical implications of this as well, I think closer proximities to failure, particularly for hypertrophy-oriented training, with moderate to high repetition ranges, particularly for some exercises, it just kind of helps as an internal gauge of accuracy and makes sure that we're actually obtaining the proximities to failure that we are intending to. Otherwise, if we're training a bunch of sets at 3 RAR with 12 to 15 reps, let's say, that's going to get over time, that can get, particularly for like multi-joint exercise, let's say, you might go a little bit lower in reps for there, but the point is kind of similar. 3 RAR can be kind of hard to gauge if there's no time in which you're ever kind of going closer to failure. Now, that's existing within the question. Now, if we kind of exist outside of the question, we don't have to pick a single set per session range or a single proximity to failure. I would absolutely blend these together. I think kind of my stock standard hypertrophy kind of potion at this point is to do, relatively moderate volumes. So you're existing on the positive but slightly diminishing returns ends of the volume relationships that we've recently quantified, and then having a good mix of non-failure and failure training pretty much for every exercise. So for your heavier exercises, I'm probably going to live in the 1 to 3 RAR range for most of my sets, and then take the last set to whatever the closest proximity to failure is for a given exercise. So for like a bench press, I'm probably not going to have somebody fail a rep if they don't have a spotter. But if you're doing something like a machine chest fly, obviously I'm going to have you do maybe even some lengthened partials kind of at the end to take that to quote unquote as deep of failure as possible. And I think that's a pretty good kind of hypertrophy recipe there to kind of coalesce all that information into one general prescription and not existing within the bounds of the question. So probably a slightly annoying answer.
No, I think that was my initial thought when reading this question, is like, I don't know why we should dichotomize it of like, are you going to do less sets to failure or more sets a few reps shy of failure?
Yeah.
I think the cop-out answer, if you will, which I think is kind of accurate, is why not both?
Yeah. Right.
But it is helpful, I think, to kind of force a choice between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm understanding your answer correctly, you're basically saying the effects of volume are going to be more potent in lower volume ranges. So if you're doubling volume at low volumes, you should probably double volume.
Exactly.
But once you get to higher volumes, let's say above 12 sets per muscle group per week or so, At that point, it does seem there's a positive effect of additional volume, but the marginal returns get smaller and smaller. And we do know there's a benefit to training closer to failure, so long as there's not obvious practical issues with that. Then at that point, maybe it makes more sense to train closer to failure.
Right.
And I think the principle to take away so that you can apply this broadly is that the dose response between volume and hypertrophy is nonlinear in the sense that there are diminishing marginal returns, as I just outlined. And then on the other hand, the benefits of training closer to failure are linear, right? So in other words, at some point, it probably doesn't make sense to just continue to pack on the volume. If you can handle more, lean into proximity to failure. But broadly speaking, I think most people can do moderate volumes, get the lion's share of the benefit from additional hypertrophy, and then train as close to failure as they can kind of tolerate, sometimes even past failure. And so long as it doesn't take away greatly from your performance within the session or completely tank your ability to train a muscle 2 times per week, just train to failure.
Yeah.